Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons, your most favorite show about D&D that records Monday at 1 or noon on Eastern Time, 9 or 10 Pacific Time in the US with just two hosts.
Who are
But it's your
us?
favorite with all those caveats. Yes. And of course your favorite co-host, Teos Abadia. Hey Teos, how's it going?
My favorite co-host, Shawn. I am the equivalent of running on fumes, which I hear is not actually a thing you can do. I tried to buy fumes the other day. No dice. But yeah, I had to work
I
all
heard
weekend
fumes were
long.
cheaper than yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You
I'm
just.
in the process of moving and I wailed my head against a steel I-beam. And I was fine yesterday. I have a splitting headache today. You get see
Oh
that
yeah, that's
right
just
there? That's the
wow.
good stuff
Oh
right
my
there.
God, we've got our thumbnail for the
Yeah.
show already. This
Knocked
far.
myself not knocked myself flat out. It was
Oh
great.
God. I
So
I have
you're super tired. I'm probably
yeah.
concussed, so it's gonna be
I have
great.
steps that aren't to code. Like whoever built this house, the steps have a too low an overhang. So I just kind of like lower my head every time I go up the stairs. But whenever I'm carrying something heavy, I have to maintain I'm trying to maintain good
Mhm.
posture as I carry it, and I of course
Mhm.
forget. And then I'm slamming my head against that thing,
Mhm.
and I like can't drop what I have. And so it's like I have to keep going or retreat. But either way, it's like the worst. So I'm sorry to hear that, Shawn. I hope you are
Yeah.
not too concussed and that
That's
the trauma of mastering dungeons doesn't
mm,
knock you out. You just let
it
us
could be
know.
the best show ever. Who
Okay.
knows? Yeah.
You apparently know my name, so
If
we're
I
at least
start
past
slurring
that.
my words.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, speaking of slurring words, let's get to our listener corner. We got lots of stuff. We're going to have to leave some out and push some off for next week. But thank you to everyone who is reaching out to us via our Discord, Patreon, YouTube, Mastodon, X/Twitter/ whatever that is, real life conventions. And this week, for the first time, LinkedIn. That's right. But first, we go to Mark via Mastodon. I've been thinking about something you mentioned in your discussion about the DMG. It was something to the effect of, why didn't they mention published adventures when they publish so many adventures? That got me wondering about how much influence a business strategy might have on game design and writing. What do you think the authors of the 2014 DMG thought that the D&D product strategy was going to be when they were writing it? I'm sure they didn't expect 5e to be as successful as it has been. Were they already planning on releasing one campaign per year or planning for multiple contingencies? And did their plans influence how the DMG was written, do you think? If they already had the next several years planned out, then it seems a missed opportunity not to prime their customers for that in the way that the DMG was structured. Or maybe they weren't sure what was going to happen and were writing a book in a way that would still work if the edition bombed and they didn't release much of anything else after the core books. Or maybe they weren't thinking about the future at all. By the same token, how is the product business strategy Wizards is taking now going to influence the way that the 2014 books are are written? Whew.
Such a
Great
good
question.
question.
Lots of stuff there. Yeah. So I'm gonna let you start while I grab a drink there.
Oh man, it's a fantastic question. I think the more that we've been looking
Mhm.
at this DMG, the more that at least I feel like this is a book that's trying to be open to a lot of potential ways that people may be interacting with the game. And having talked to a lot of designers that were part of the core team, I don't think they had knowledge of how 5e was going to be received. They were hoping it was really good. They felt good about it. It was a huge playtest. They could tell that the playtest was involving a lot of people, but no, they didn't know that it would be this successful. I don't think anybody in RPGs knew that an RPG could be as successful as 5e has been. Like it seemed that was an impossible tier, if you will. Um, but
Yeah.
but that said, I think that they were thinking the game was a little more open and loose, and they were. What I have heard is the strategy at Wizards was, we're making this great game. Management is not breathing down our back around it, so we can make the books that we want to make. Because the corporate strategy is sell t-shirts and license materials and video games and things like that and make your money that way, sort of leveraging the brand, leveraging those kinds of things. It's not so heavily about what the role-playing game is, and the role-playing can just do what it does sort of lightly in the background. So therefore it's very flexible and open, and you can do whatever you want with it. And maybe less about, and if you think initially, one published adventure a year to just keep the buzz going, right, was what they're kind of thinking.
Yeah. And if they don't expect tons of new players to come in, like what happened with 5e, then you can create a DMG that's more for experienced game masters. That's why we see the DMG being not, hey, brand new game master, here's how you run the table. But what we see is here, a book of tables, right? A book of inspiration for DMs that already know what they're doing. So when it became so popular, they had to rely on other ways to teach new game masters, which was live streams that they weren't even producing themselves, or maybe were, but that became its thing. And that's why it's going to be interesting going into 2024. When we see a revised DMG, are we going to see more? We know that more people are coming in, so let's teach you how to DM. Or is it going to be taking what's already there and just expanding on it? However they do, Wizards and Hasbro and D&D's marketing and social engagement team will need to be very careful and be very upfront about helping people. And that's very hard when the company that you are working for is constantly getting into trouble with its fans or with the general public, right? Because what we would love to do, as say you and I were running D&D at Wizards, we would love to just go on to social media and say, hey, check this out, check this link out, do this, hey, here are some tips. But what happens is every time we do that, we get, oh, where are the Pinkertons? And that not only doesn't help new players or new DMs, it actively works against that because it distracts people from learning the actual game. So it's going to be a brand new issue when they release these books and how they're going to use them to support what we're expecting to be new players still coming into the game.
Yeah, and the reality is there's nobody out there who knows whether when this book comes out, is there going to be a huge growth of 5e, or is there going to be a huge decline? There isn't a person out there that knows the answer to that, neither at Wizards or outside. Nobody has. I don't even know that people even have the raw materials with which to formulate knowledge of that. We simply don't know. And I haven't met anybody who has any knowledge about that, right? And so what should the strategy be? To grow the base hugely, to plan for a contraction? Nobody has any clue, right? And so you just do what you can and off you go. So, I don't know when it comes to this next series of books, is the DMG being written with growth in mind or stability or just write the best DMG you can?
Exactly. So even if the business side gives the creative side a mandate for what to create, who knows if that's going to actually meet the needs or not, if the creative team will be able to do what they're asked or not. Maybe they completely fail to meet the mandates, but actually end up making a good book accidentally. We just don't know.
No telling. Yeah, and sometimes that can muck with things, right? If corporate says make this game, primarily for new players, or corporate says, we really need to get the invested player to spend more. What do you do with that, right? And those might seem very reasonable things for corporate to say. Who knows if corporate's even saying anything, right? So it's just the best editions, though, have seemed to be ones where corporate just let people design, right?
Yep, for sure. All right, we have the next question from Toast Milk via the Patreon Discord. A question that's been burning in my mind since you started the review of the DMG has been to hear your opinion on whether WotC's focus for the 50th anniversary of D&D should have been revising the DM's guide or making it into something more robust and becoming more helpful for us newer, less experienced DMs than the loose collection of tools that the 2014 version seems to be, instead of having the public focus on revising a popular rule system that many are happy with. I know a revised DMG is coming in 2024, and the business answer to my inquiry, the PHB is for players and therefore a larger audience to sell to. But curious to hear your opinions, if you put the sales factor aside, if the game and WotC would have been better served and generate more excitement by using the 50th anniversary to roll out a DM's guide that addresses the shortcomings that you and others have pointed out, included other useful tools that have developed over the decade of 5e play, and craft one of the best DM guides the company has produced. I say that because part of my frustration with the 1D&D playtest has been its focus on player options and generating excitement on that end, with little guidance or consideration for helping DMs implement changes or make their jobs more intuitive and easier to manage.
That's an excellent question too. Shawn, it's really hard to separate that business side, and I know the question's asking to do that, but it is so fundamental to every consideration. But the game would benefit from more advice of all sorts. And in a world without money, where one could just make the best game possible, then that advice would not just be an updated DMG, but also a player's handbook that really worked more closely, more in tandem with the DM side. And you can see 5e tries to do that, right? It tries to have, like, we'll talk about downtime. It tries to have a little downtime in the player's handbook, a little downtime in the DMG. But what it never does is have that conversation of, hey, here's what your DM is going to be doing. Here's how to dovetail into that. It doesn't really achieve that balance. And so ideally, both the PHB and the DMG would be working together. The PHB preparing players for what the DM's doing, getting them all working together. And there could be a future state where the game really does achieve this, but it's probably going to take several iterations to get there. 80 maybe. And in that moneyless world, we'd also want lots of guides. Like if you look at how D&D took Stormwreck Isle and made all these videos of how to run the start and how to develop from there, and all these different pieces that add to it. I those seem to me really cool. I'm not a new DM, and it's hard for me to put on my DM hat, but they seem very useful. Are they getting watched a lot by new DMs? I don't know, but if they are, then that could exist for every product, right? Every product could come with these kinds of walkthroughs. But we don't live in that world, right? And worse than that, we live in a world where Wizards is playing a game of chess with fans, kind of like you said, Shawn, right? Where every step you take is judged and is a challenge and is difficult. If you launch a new edition, history is very clear that fans are going to rebel against you, and it has to be incredibly good or you lose lots of players. If you slightly modify the game, then all kinds of people are saying, why don't you give me a new edition? You didn't do enough. I don't like these changes. They don't go far enough. They're arbitrary. And it's really difficult. The only way to overcome this is to have your rules be so good that everybody has to shut up and agree it's good. And 5e did that. I mean, there were so many 5e naysayers at the beginning of 5e that finally had to go, okay, I guess it is doing well. I guess people do like this. And there's still people who will tell you that 5e doesn't have a good rules system, or that, it's overrated. And it's amazing. It's the best RPG by so many measures. And yet, it still has to contend with that criticism. So, I don't know. What do you think, Shawn?
Well, I think that chess is a great analogy, because not only do you have to do what Teos said and think about those issues, you have to think, if you create a beginner's guide, you are automatically telling experienced players this is not for you, even if it would be good for them. So to create something that teaches the basics of role playing would be super handy for people just coming into the field. But you're cutting your market by putting out something that points in that direction. Yet that's what people might need. And the DMs Guild, in a lot of ways, could be something that fits uh, the needs of the market,
Mm.
but then you need to have a way to point people in the right direction to the right products.
Mhm.
So instead of having the beginner's guide, you could say, here is Stormwreck Isle. Over here, if you want the really basic version, for a $5 PDF, you can get the super streamlined explanation intro to it. Therefore, you're not wasting pages in the actual book doing it. People that don't want the beginner's guide don't need to buy it, but it's there. But then that's hard too, because you have to market it. You have to
Mhm.
communicate well. You have to point people to it from a place where they will already be. You have to be 6 steps ahead, like in a chess game. So you're aware that you're going to have this when you publish this, so you can point people to it, and the link will be there, and the link will be correct, and you will have the price, and you have the mark, right? All of that needs to happen. And it's just outside of the realm of large businesses to be able to do that well,
Yeah.
because every part of the company has to communicate with the other, be on the same page, understand deadlines, understand uh, the business needs and the financial needs and the personnel needs of all of the different, and it's so hard to
Mhm.
do. So
Yeah,
it
Shawn,
could all of this be done? Yes. Will it? Probably not.
probably not. And I do think that the this DMG, the 2014 DMG, it tries to inspire through a lot of ideas and concepts. And that is
Mhm.
a throwback to the AD&D DMG, which a lot of us think of very fondly with a lot of nostalgia for how it did that for us. And I think that is neat, but I think that today's audience wants more how-to guides. And it is possible to write a how-to
Mhm.
guide that is both good for new players and for existing players, right? I think of like Mike Shea's products. One of the reasons we mention them off on the show is because they do that. They please an expert DM and a new DM pretty equally because it's common sense material and approaches that can benefit almost anybody. And I think the DMG could have more of
Mhm.
that. So maybe that's kind of my distilled answer. There's all this larger reality, but I think that there is a way that you can kind of know that you're not going to really lose. Like, yes, you're inspiring, but you're giving enough tips that anybody of any expertise could enjoy.
Mhm. So thank you for that question, Toast Milk. We have Emil Lynn via LinkedIn. So Emil said, I'm a huge fan of the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire. I've spent many hours enjoying this book. I looked you up out of curiosity, and imagine my surprise when I found out you have a background in technical writing.
Mm.
I would love to hear about your transition. So I actually get this question a lot, which is why I asked Emil's permission to post it from LinkedIn to here. And it's important to remember that game writing is, for the most part, technical writing. And it's not only technical writing, it's a very specific kind of technical writing. Uh, you're working with both new material and customers and existing material and customers when you're writing a game, especially if you're using an existing system. So you always have to keep that in mind, as we were just talking about, right? Brand new people, brand new players, existing DMs, existing players. When you're creating rules, you are also at the same time in game writing encouraging other people's creativity with those rules, but not so much creativity that they can move outside of the rules and create their own thing, because you need those rules as the framework for what you're building. So when I'm hiring a role-playing game writer, a role-playing game designer, what I'm looking for are people who can write clearly first and foremost. And some of the clearest writing that you're ever going to see is technical writing,
Mhm.
because it by definition has to be clear. So if I can tell that you know what you are saying, you know what you need to say, you've thought it through, then you can actually hit the mark by writing clearly and by expressing the things you need to express in a way that anyone can understand. Then I know that you can take the next step and be creative and help
Mhm.
other people be creative. So when I'm looking for people, I am looking for that by reading the words you've written, I know that you know what you're doing. And so therefore I can trust you to say it in a way that will allow me to know what I'm doing. And that's why technical writing so easily translates into game writing. Uh, that's
Yeah.
my answer. So
Yeah. I
thank you
love
for the
it.
question, Emil.
Love it.
We have Tulku via Mastodon who says, love the show. Just wanted to mention that keys from the Golden Vault could be an example of the Agents of X campaign. Maybe that differentiates a bit more from the Thing of Many Parts, as the different missions in the Agent of X are only related in the sense that they were given by an organization and with very little overarching plot. So,
Yeah, great point, right? And absolutely. And in fact, a lot of the adventure books that have one shots in them, as Keys does, could work really well that way. Candlekeep, Radiant Citadel, even Yawning Portal is a little bit like that, right? And if you just added a little bit of a wrapper to it, you'd really have that Agents of X, right? You know, like, hey, Candlekeep is hiring you to carry out all these separate missions. Radiant Citadel, you know, it's a hub, and we need you to do all these various things. Yawning Portal, you know, hey, someone who's sending you to all through the Yawning Portal to all these different locations. And even Icefire Peak, right? It starts that way, where it's like the job board, right? And so then only over time do you see some relationships between them. So yeah, that's a neat catch.
mm, okay. And last question from Biotic Hamster via our Patreon Discord. I wonder what your thoughts are on why horror seems to be so popular in D&D. A
Mhm.
couple weeks ago, James Introcaso mentioned this topic on the show. He brought up the fact that even in Curse of Strahd, once you start fighting the wolves, you suddenly remember how powerful you are, stripping away the illusion of the horror that the setting the game is trying to present. 5e seems to me to be a game that's all about power fantasy. Characters blinded? No biggie, we'll take a rest. No time for a rest? How about a quick spell to remove it? Characters dead? Revivify fixes that. No revivify? Cast gentle repose and take them to the temple. Resurrection magic can be had for a cost. Heaven knows there's no shortage of gold in all those bags of holding. But horror is about making people feel powerless, right? And yet, so many D&D adventures seem to insist on including horror elements. The upcoming Phandelver and Below remakes the classic vanilla D&D adventure into a cosmic horror adventure. The most popular adventure for 5e is Curse of Strahd, a horror-themed one. Out of the Abyss, Tomb of Annihilation, Descent into Avernus, Icewind Dale are all arguably horror-based campaigns, and third-party companies seem to be disproportionately supporting horror-based content too, such as Shawn's employer, Ghostfire Gaming, which makes admittedly really awesome content all around the genre. Still, I can't help but feel like horror and the 5e system are fundamentally misaligned. Wouldn't horror fans be better served by a different system? And wouldn't 5e be better served by more content in different genres?
Mm.
And ultimately, what drives everyone to produce so much horror content for 5e? Yeah, we've had this question a few times,
Mhm.
and I feel like I've discussed it to the point where I am now just repeating myself, even though I don't know if I've ever discussed it necessarily here. We have now a new thread in our Discord, Patreon Discord, just popped up to discuss this. And I'm gonna let Teos take over for in just a second. But the first thing you need to know is define your terms. What do you mean by horror? If your idea of horror is Friday the 13th slasher films, then we're going to have one discussion. If it's cosmic horror, Lovecraftian, you can't know the horror that's out there. If you do know it, you'll go crazy. Is Dracula horror or is Twilight horror? Or is both? Is it jump scares or is it heredity? Are you trying to unsettle the players or are you trying to unsettle their characters so that they can role play being unsettled? Uh, all of those questions come into this discussion. Okay, Teos, go ahead.
So, yeah, this was super fascinating. Even though it's come up a lot, I saw this in sort of what may be a new light, at least for me. And what I thought was, I don't think people actually want a horror campaign. And Tomb of Annihilation came up, which I don't think is a horror campaign for a number of reasons. It's a pulp kind of fun Indiana Jones type thing more than anything else. But it is lethal. And one of the things that's interesting is very few people say the reason I love Tomb of Annihilation was because it was super lethal and my character died. That was awesome. No, in fact, the lethality is one of the most problematic aspects of it that people try to tweak so it doesn't mess them up too much because they're loving everything else about it. But they might be drawn to it for it, right? The idea of it's like we say this whole time, like, oh, it's a super challenging adventure. It's sort of like metal bands will always be like, we're coming out with a heavier sound on this album. You're like, I don't know, the last one was pretty heavy. I don't know what you're doing. But I think just saying that is like the sales item. And we want to believe that we want that. We want to believe that we want a horror experience that's horrifying. But reality is, we want to play powerful characters doing powerful things. I don't care what the genre is in D&D. And D&D seems to work just fine. And one of the questions I asked in the Patreon Discord was, have you played a horror campaign where it didn't really have these elements? And was that bad? And I didn't hear anyone say it was bad. Like, I think that we're actually perfectly fine with the idea that we should be scared, but we're actually not scared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know if horror is supposed to be scary, except for the jump scares, which you can't. Well, I mean, you can do it at the table, right? You can talk quiet men talk real loud and everyone jumps and haha, jump scare. And is that what you want? Is that
right?
What you want in the game? And I don't think many people do. So I think it's more about mystery, right? It's more that gothic horror that I think that we're talking about. But even the gothic horror is not horror. You go back and read the original gothic novels. I think the Castle of Otranto is considered like the first one, and it's really just about secret passages and mysterious people, which we get in D&D anyway.
Right.
D&D itself is sort of a gothic game in that sense.
I think that where horror can come in is where you really want to have that feeling of hopelessness. Every turn could be a wrong turn. One false move and there could be a problem, which we truly get in other games, right? Call of Cthulhu or anything that's using a Cthulhu type mythos generally works better because the characters are very fragile. And so a wrong turn can truly be a wrong turn. And we know that, and we come in accepting that. And I mean, every time I've played Call of Cthulhu, I treat my character like a disposable thing, and as an experience, not as campaign progression or something like that. And now I've never played a very long Call of Cthulhu. Well, I played one long Call of Cthulhu campaign, but in general, they're one shots, and that's the most fun, is because probably I will die in some way, and it's about the storytelling of it. But D&D is, when we do D&D and horror, we may say we want that, but we often don't. And so I think that the answer to this question is that it sells really well because we're attracted to those elements as concepts. And then what we actually want is to be superheroes. And D&D delivers that in spades.
Right. The most angry that I see players at the table, whether I'm running the game or playing in the game or observing the game, is when characters feel powerless.
Yeah.
Is when the players know that this clock is ticking and they realize we can't stop it.
Yeah.
I've looked through my character sheet, I've looked through my spell list, I've looked at everything I have, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. That's when people get mad. That's when players get angry.
And I want to talk about
in my experience over many years.
Yeah, just really quickly, the opposite side, because I can hear Graham Ward on our Discord already. But because he runs really good horror campaigns, and I've been in a horror-ish D&D game, 4-hour adventure with him, and I know he does this really well. But you can run great horror experiences with D&D if you develop those capabilities and work with your players to have that. But it takes a lot of work and knowledge, and it's hard to write. And so most D&D experiences aren't providing you that. But it is possible. You certainly can. It's just not what's usually available, right? And that's why Rime of the Frost Maiden does not give you that, even though the marketing may have sounded like we were in for some amazing horror experience and we're going to, live the Thing version of D&D. No, you're rescuing chewingas as one of your first quests. Like, they're cute and cuddly and it's silly. And like, horrified yet, Shawn?
Yeah. I am horrified for sure. My day is just all horror as I'm trying to create games. And so the question is why? Why do people make these try to make these horror RPGs?
Or dark?
Because it's popular.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really, really popular. My wife and I went and saw Oppenheimer this past week, and all of the previews were horror tinged things, from Disney's Haunted Mansion to a new Exorcist movie. And my wife looked at me and said, why? We're here watching Oppenheimer, sort of a historical movie. Why am I seeing all these horror previews? And I'm like, because it's the most popular genre out there right now. And so everybody wants, it's a popular experience. I just don't know if role-playing games, for the most part, deliver that experience as well as other types of media.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep. But it is definitely a hot topic, and if you are a patron of the show, you can jump onto the Patreon Discord and you can have that discussion with people who are very vehement about speaking to the topic. Now let's get into a little bit of news, shall we? The first news being Wizards of the Coast has released the system reference document into the Creative Commons for Spanish, French, Italian, and German language users. I know that is something that's been near and dear to your heart, Teos.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. We had heard they were going to do this, but it's one of those things, there have been a number of things of, we intend to do this. Well, will they? And here it is. It's out. And it's sort of funny because the write-up, which was on the D&D community update page, said, we are bringing this, but it's like, no, as in like, it's here. The links are active. It is really hard to find anywhere else. So you kind of have to go to the community page. There's a link in our show notes. And you can get English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish, the SRD. Super, super cool. Now, it is worth noting that this is in the Creative Commons, not the Open Gaming license, which I thought was interesting. Won't generally impact most creators, but if you were doing something like, I want to write a Spanish language product that uses Cold Press material, then you would technically have to do your own translation, but I guess could look at the SRD for that. It's a little confusion, but there could be some corner cases where the OGL is better than the Creative Commons. Usually, as I've written and talked about in videos on this subject, you would generally want to use the Creative Commons these days. But that is the only limitation, is if you're trying to use OGL material from some other publisher, then you'd need to use an OGL product and license. And technically, you would need to use the English SRD, but you could probably pull the translations from the Creative Commons. So, yeah. Now,
that's great. And as you know in our show notes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as you know in our show notes, that these can be used as sort of a basic rule system. So we don't have a set of basic rules in these languages like you could download, but you can use this as a basic rule set if you need to.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the remaining piece that I really want. It's something that when I interviewed Kyle, I asked Kyle Brink about this and for this. I still do want to see the basic rules, promoted more, just plain old promoted more in English, but also these translations are basically the basic rules. Let's put it out there so that people can get a more accessible a window into the game and start playing D&D without feeling like they have to pirate it or spend more money than they can afford to spend. So I hope that maybe that would be around the corner. We shall see.
Next, is it possible that we'll get a D&D movie sequel? Anything's possible, but it was discussed because comicbook.com reported on an article in Variety that profiled Paramount Pictures CEO Brian Collins. Collins discussed several projects that received critical acclaim but were disappointing at the box office. So therefore, he didn't rule out making a D&D movie sequel, but says it needs to be cheaper to make. His quote is, "Even a star's ability to make audiences swoon isn't always enough to guarantee that a movie will make money. Babylon, an epic about the silent movie era, collapsed at the box office when Paramount released it last December, despite starring Brad Pitt. While Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves will end up losing money, even though Chris Pine led this ensemble cast. Robbins isn't abandoning the idea of more Dungeons and Dragons, though if there's a sequel, he says, we've got to figure out a way to make it for less." And that's interesting because I'm wondering if there was an increase in sales of books,
Mhm.
of merchandise after the release of the movie. So even if there was a loss at the movie level, if it did act as a marketing vehicle that did increase sales enough that it might be worth it to make another sequel to see if you can continue that upturn in sales.
Yeah, and the one answer, which we'll talk about later, seems to be that yes, it did increase sales. Um, like the player's handbook, maybe like by 1,000 units, minimum of 1,000 units per week. But the question becomes, is that overall? And it also launched new products, right? They had comic books, and oh, look, I've got one here. This guy,
Mhm.
right? Things like this.
Mhm.
Um, so that's all new stuff they got to sell, and toys and tie-ins. So yeah, it may be that it's worth it, but Paramount cares about the movie side of things unless they get a cut of these other bits. I don't know exactly how it works. So it does need to be a little
Yeah.
cheaper. And all of this is confusing because it's in this idea of these movies that they were talking about were all made in a COVID high cost time where things were more expensive
Mhm.
due to the
True.
pandemic, and the box office has absolutely collapsed. So who knows what's going to happen to movies, right? Will these guys all go bankrupt? Will Barbie save them all and lead to a giant resurgence? It's unclear. And so the D&D movie will have to somehow play off of all of that to try to survive. It's complicated.
Yeah, and this doesn't even take into account this series, right? This streaming series that is supposed to be in production, that we haven't really heard much about since. So
Yeah.
uh,
Right.
that may add some either either if it's popular, give another reason to try again, or if it's doesn't do well, a reason to just wash your hands of the whole idea of having D&D based streaming or movies. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah.
Gen Con. By the time this show drops, Gen Con will be just a day away. It's
Mm.
coming this weekend, Thursday through Sunday. I will be there, mostly conscious, I would say. Uh, Anything going on at Gen Con that has caused you to take interest, Teos?
Well, last show we were kind of saying like, where is the darn schedule? And I think the day before our show released, we recorded on Monday, and on Tuesday, D&D finally provided the schedule. So on D&D Beyond, you can find a sort of blog post by Wizards with the schedule, which has what the Magic the Gathering schedule did and a little more, plus a lot of apologies around how most of these events are sold out, which I thought was kind of hilarious. So we'll
Mhm.
see how it goes. I think one thing that I looked at, like, it is great to see D&D back at Gen Con, and we talked about this last episode.
Mhm.
But one of the things was, hey, we've heard the community. We are going to make staff available. And looking at this schedule, I didn't see where that's the case, right? So I didn't see
Mhm.
obvious, clear meet and greets or talk to us. I do hear that there's a summit being planned. It sounds like it's mostly about for companies that are there, so like sort of partner level type things. Is the emphasis this time? I think, but it's unclear. There hasn't been anything publicly stated, but there aren't obvious like Chris Perkins is going to be playing D&D in the AL area or anything like that. So I hope those kinds of things happen, because that was the part that I thought was really missing. I didn't think that what was missing was, oh, D&D is going to have some people stream a game at Gen Con. That's not what I thought was missing from the Gen Con picture. And it is nice to have some seminars, but there's a lot more that there are different types of things that I'd like to see the staff involved in.
Yep. So I am going to be walking around the show more than I usually do. Usually I'm just heads down running games. So I'm going to be strolling about, talking to people, and I'm going to be taking some notes. So I'll be able to talk about it more intelligently, hopefully, next week. The DMs Guild has clarified its artificial intelligence policy. The DMs Guild has seen a ton of products that are AI generated. There was a great outcry, and so it finally released an updated policy. At this time, the DMs Guild will not accept standalone artwork products that utilize AI generated art. So stock art, token packs, maps, portraits, miniatures, etc., if they are solely AI generated, will not be able to be sold. AI generated art will be permitted in rulebooks and adventures, but it must be tagged as such. And then if there are titles that do not comply, they will be subject to removal from the marketplace, and repeat offenders will have their publishing permissions revoked. What are your thoughts, Mr. Abadia?
It's nowhere close to perfect, but it's at least a start, because what's starting to happen here and in other places too is there are just people who realize, oh, wait, I can profit. And they just have their AI of choice spit out endless amounts of images, and then they just create packages. And they're just starting to be, endless numbers of products that were just on there full of AI generated NPCs, AI generated tokens, AI generated maps. And it's all just, you know, filling that kind of area there with very very little look for quality. There's also been a lot of AI generated products where it's an AI generated source book or class guide or whatever, because all of these AIs are getting good enough to create something that's kind of like a subclass, and sometimes might, if first blush, look like a decent subclass, and then you start looking at it closely and realize the problems with it. So it was junking up the place, and it's the exact opposite of what the DMs Guild needs now. The DMs Guild does not need an overwhelming amount of low quality material. So I'm glad to see them at least put their foot down on someone would have to mix in some real things along with the AI stuff, which then makes that more expensive and perhaps cuts down on that behavior. We shall have to see.
Mhm. We have information about top sellers in crowdfunding. So there were two stories last week. The first came from an article on EN World looking at the top TTRPG crowdfunders of all time. EN World is constantly looking at Kickstarters and reporting on them. So what they did was they took the top Kickstarters as reported by Kickstarter, removed board games, minis, or other types to reveal whether the top companies in tabletop role-playing games. Not surprisingly, Magpie Games comes out at the top at 10.3 million because of their Avatar game. We have Free League and Fria Ligan, which is, I think it's like Free League in
Swedish.
in Swedish or something. So they are the top. If you add those two, because they have different accounts, so if you add them together, then they are the top, and everyone else drops down a spot. But since they have two Kickstarter accounts, they are considered separate. Monte Cook Games comes in second at 9.8 million. Richard Thomas of Onyx Path, Hit Point Press, and Cobalt Press round out the top five. We have some other notables. We have MCDM at 7th, Savage Worlds at 8th, Goodman Games at 11th, Ghostfire Gaming at 12th, Nord Games at 19th. I do want to say that Ghostfire has its own account. It also has an account called Eldermancy that it's a partnership. So Ghostfire does a lot of partnerships with other companies. If you add those partnerships together with Eldermancy, with the Dungeon Dudes, with XP to level 3, Ghostfire actually comes in at 9 million, which
Wow.
would move it up just below Monte Cook Games. Now, it's all separate accounts with all those partnerships. So, but I just want to point that out to show
Yeah.
that Ghostfire is has its little ectoplasmic paws in a lot of different Kickstarter products. What are some of your thoughts on this, Teos?
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff and really interesting to look at. If you look at the overall projects in gaming, then you see like Come On is number one, Steamforge Games, Awaken Realms, Dwarven Forge is next, then Wormwood Gaming, Reaper
Mhm.
Miniatures is at 12th. So it's nice to kind of what Ian World did that was really nice is break out the what is really an RPG project versus
Right.
what is primarily miniatures or something else or primarily a board game but has a role playing game component, and then didn't count those, right? So some of it is arguable, but it's nice to kind of compare and look at that. Um, it's a real strength in that this industry was incapable of those kinds of numbers just a relatively short time away. So this really represents a huge change to look, like something Monte Cook Games, which is a relatively small company, that's a really nice amount of
Yeah.
money to do so that they can do the things they do, like offer healthcare to their staff, really good healthcare and
Yep.
benefits and leave and all kinds of things. So that's hopefully what we're talking about here is right that Kickstarter can hopefully enable this over time, or any kind of crowdfunding platform can enable this over time for all these companies to have great pay, great employees, and all of that. It's not easy. We know that. We know that Monty Cook isn't sitting there, on gold toilets. Like it's difficult, but it is at least tenable. Whereas not too many years ago, it was not tenable, and so this is great.
Yeah. It was fun to read and see that growth, but also show how peripheral stuff, right? Those minis and things actually sell more than games, or at least revenue wise.
Yeah,
The second bit of news was from the YouTube channel Roll for Combat that shared some book sales data. The data comes from BookScan, which tracks the sales of all books sold in the US through two big box stores. So this doesn't include direct sales, digital sales, smaller gaming stores, comic book stores, or Amazon. And I'm going to let you take over from there because
sure.
you've got
Yeah,
some
there's a
insight into
UCLA
this.
study that said that BookScan might be 75% of all retail sales, but as the video noted, it's hard to know whether that's true in tabletop. I would guess not. And I kind of guessed at some numbers down below, but this is an interesting case because this BookScan data, and on the video, link in our show notes, on the video they walk through and share kind of the actual screen with all these results. And I geeked out on this too. I mean, I don't know how many hours I spent on this. A lot, looking at all this and analyzing, thinking about it. Like tying into our previous discussion, the Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves: The Road to Neverwinter $30 product, which is a novel, has sold 16,771 copies to date. Uh, Through BookScan. So some other percentage beyond that in gaming stores or other places, but for a product like this might be 75% of its sales. And then so that's when you talk about that movie effect, right? Well, you get 16, 17,000 sales of this thing in a relatively short amount of time, and then you have like 5 other products. Well, that can be worth it, right? But back to kind of the core RPG stuff. The Player's Handbook is the top seller with over 1.5 million sales, and it's currently selling about 2,000 per week in these channels. This is also interesting to note because one of the things that D&D has that I don't know that it's included in here they often have specific Wizards has specific deals to sell directly to big box stores versus the normal way they sell to box stores. I don't know if that's considered direct or if that's considered big box stores. So it could be higher even at those same places. Hard to say.
Mm.
After the Player's Handbook, we have the starter set with 1 million copies sold to date, selling around 200 a week. The DMG has a total of 823,000, Monster Manual 780,000. Then it's Essentials, Xanathars, Tasha's has 347k. Top Adventures, Curse of Strahd with 147,000, followed by Dragon Heist, Horde of the Dragon Queen, Yawning Portal, Saltmarsh, Rime, Tomb at 82,000. Some really interesting things like Spelljammer is 84,000, but drops really quickly after getting in huge initial sales of 47,000 in the first 4 weeks, and then it really slows down. Was that because of bad word of mouth? Who knows, right? There's absolutely no impact from the OGL when you look at these charts. So you look at the period of time where people are talking about the OGL, nothing. The movie did bump 3 things up. So you see this bump of, I think it was about 1,000 copies per week in the Player's Handbook for a while, due to them right around the time the movie releases. The 5e Player's Handbook has sold about 3 times what the 3e Player's Handbook sold in these same channels, which is impressive. Tasha's in its first year sold twice as many copies as what the Player's Handbook sold in its first year, showing the growth of the game, which is really neat. Critical Role doesn't have a strong effect, which I was really surprised. So Wild Mount is 115, but Eberron is higher than that. Ravnica is pretty close to that. There's so many fascinating things, and one of the things that came out of this is 2 big questions that I had. One is like, well, what are the real numbers? Like, what can we extrapolate from this? And there's one little piece of data that I've noted elsewhere on my blog, where in an interview, I think on Dragon Talk, Stan, who is often a kind of part-time employee of Wizards of the Coast, said that in 2017, the Player's Handbook had sold 800,000 copies. And I've heard other sources say about 1 million at that time. So somewhere between 800 to 1 million had been sold in 2017. And if you look at what BookScan in these screenshots showed at 2017, this would suggest that the BookScan numbers are about a quarter of all sales. And so then you'd take that, 1.5 million and you'd multiply by 4 to know the number of player handbooks that are out there. So maybe 6 million copies have been sold, which, as book publishing goes, is really good. The folks in the video are sort of saying like, our industry is so small, these numbers are really small and kind of pathetic. But I don't think they actually are, from a number of things. One is that if you multiply them by 4, that is pretty strong. And the consistency of it, because there are so many products. It's one thing to say like, oh, I'm the Obamas, I wrote a book, it's really big. But these are a lot of books. Like, this list goes on and on. When they're scrolling through this in the video, D&D, even just for 5e, has so many products, Shawn, that overall volume is really, really quite significant. So I don't know. What do you think? I've yapped for a while.
Yeah. Well, it is small when you compare it to other things, but it's not small when you compare it to itself from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago, etc. And so it's that growth that is, to have a book like Tasha's sell more than within its first year than the Player's Handbook did in its first year. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. That we call it the death spiral, right? The role-playing game death spiral of each book selling less and less and less, and this selling more is something that if you had told me 10 years ago when 5e came out that would happen, I would have bet my mortgage on it that there's no way that could have ever happened, and it did, which gives me hope that this industry and this hobby that I thought was certainly dying may not be. And it gives this pessimistic heart a little bit of hope for the future.
People really do forget that we, back in, say, 3rd edition, were so sure that this hobby was dying and that these were the last gasps, and we were all going to age out and nobody new was coming in. There was no diversity. It was the same old people playing. And this is right wild. I mean, 4E saw some growth, things like gaming stores through the Encounters program, but 5th edition, its spread is unbelievable. And these numbers are unbelievable compared to anything before. It's important to keep in context that there are many third-party role-playing game companies out there that can't outsell the original Dungeons and Dragons sets back in the 70s. Like those have higher sales numbers than a lot of third-party sales, right? And that's where you just look at it and you're like, our industry is going nowhere, right? But it's 5th edition, it's this Kickstarter, crowdfunding, like that's where we've seen the industry has been able to outdo itself and reach people in ways that you couldn't just through store shelves, right? And so, yeah, all win.
Exactly. Speaking of winning, that is our news for the week.